Uh, a while back, Andy, the Southeast Contest Club, and I did a little bit of talking, and he was looking for a talk about some basic concepts about contesting. We do a lot of things about how do you contest? What are the tips to make this happen? What's tips to break a pile up? How do you do this? How do you do that? But here are a couple things that popped up about how do you actually go about improving yourself as a contester. So he thought I might have something to share for that. So I figured I'd make this presentation up for it. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Share my screen? Okay. And competitive contesting concepts is what we titled this thing. Before we get into it, I figured a little bit of explanation is needed. If I can get this to kick off. And this is how I view contesters. If you get any given contest, there are non-contesters in it, and those are just people that are award hunting or testing a radio, just playing radio, whatever the case may be. Then you got casual contesters who just hit or miss, just something to do with the radio and take themselves away from home for a little bit, kind of like playing a video game or whatnot. And then you got the serious contesters. They're the ones that are actually trying to improve and trying for a respectable score. And then some of them graduate up to the top and try to be actually competitive contesters. There's the ones who want to win or place in the top five. It used to be the top 10, but we've got so darn many different categories now that you can enter that I changed that to a top five type deal. So what I'm looking for here in this particular one is I'm targeting the people who are serious contesters. They're actively looking to improve, and in fact, they want to get all the way up here to competitive. They want to be the winners. They want to be in the top five. And if you can't get that high, at least get as high as possible for your situation. And that's what the whole concept here of targeting this is. And to put this in a little bit different terms, this could be your neighborhood people playing football. This could be the high school football team. This could be the college team, and then you got the pros. So we're looking to go from essentially the college to the Pro Bowl. And although all this stuff isn't necessarily going to apply, and in fact, these are just ideas, well, a lot of it may not apply to you at all. We're going to help you develop your own plan for coming up as high as you can in the rankings. So with that, one day I sat down, as the old Swamp Fox people know, I've said this 100 times. One day I put myself in the serious category there. I said, I need to improve. And when I started looking at the other scores, I asked myself, how come I'm 19th in the scores? I didn't understand why people who had the same type of station I did were beating me so badly. And of course, I figured they knew something that I didn't, which they did. And in fact, there are several things that they knew that I didn't. And being competitive involves doing all those many things well. And this isn't an all-inclusive talk, but it'll give you some ideas of different things. You need to have good, solid operating skills. You have to have good technical knowledge, use effective antennas, and understand your equipment capabilities. Although I'd been a ham for 25 years before I really started trying to become a competitive contester, uh, I didn't know diddly squat about what it meant to actually be a ham radio operator. So I developed that technical knowledge as part of my quest. And a lot of people don't consider automation being important, but it truly is, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why in a little bit. In operating environment design, if you're not comfortable keeping your butt in chair, you're going to quit early and bail. And that's not conducive to being a competitive contester. And last and definitely the most, and what I want you to get out of this talk, if nothing else, you have to have the commitment to improve. That means you need to actively go out and spend time. It's not, you can't just sit down and start bringing home all these awards like Dave does all the time. You got to go ahead and actually work at it to go ahead and find yourself able to place well up in the top of the scores. I drew an analogy to football a minute ago, and we call this radio sport, which it really is, another talk for another day. But like sports, many people in a sports, but there are few stars, and winning is beyond most of us. So one of the first things you ought to reconcile yourself to is I'm not going to be at the top of the heap right away. Seek small victories. And once you Find them small victories. It's a continuous improvement process. You pick an achievable goal. Once you reach that, go ahead and immediately pick another. Raise the bar and move yourself up. Just don't set that bar too high so it's unattainable as you go out. An improvement strategy. All right, I want to improve. How do I go about doing it? My background for military and definitely in the civilian world dealt a lot with process improvement, and was a maintenance planner, industrial maintenance planner. And in both of those circumstances, you got to know what your end goal is. So for me, I applied that same principle to it. I sat down and I thought, what is it I want to get out of contesting? And in my case, I wanted to get into the top 5. So I defined what I wanted to do. Once you define what you want to do, you need to take and do a critique. And a lot of people hear that term, but they don't really know what it is. A detailed analysis and assessment of something. Detailed is the key. You can't just sit down and come up with 1 or 2 things. You really need to sit down and analyze what your situation is. And in this case, you ought to critique yourself. Are you good? Well, how do you know if you're good? Compare yourself to other people. Stop in a contest. Ed just mentioned he stopped by and listened to K5ZD a time or two. Maybe it was an email or a reflector post, whatever. But stop and listen to people that are out there and really compare yourself to them. Are you good? And if not, what are your weaknesses? This is something that really hit home to me. And I guess it was kind of a modification of a football coach. But a contester is someone who can take his'n and beat your'n, meaning I can take my station and beat you. And then I can go around and go to your station and take your station with you on mine, and I can beat you again if I was a contester. And that really sums it up. It's the operator, far more so than the station, that determines how good you are and what you can make plays. So keep that thought in mind. Contester is someone who can take his and beat yours, and turn around and take yours and beat his. Besides yourself, you got to critique your station. One of the things you're going to do is, if you want to be, what's your goal? If you want to just place well in a regional, or if you want to win South Carolina on 80% of the time, whatever, actually make it a quantifiable goal. What do you have to do to achieve that goal? And a lot of people will throw out right off the bat, I got to have an amplifier. Well, that's not necessarily the case, but it may be. Sit and ask, what do you really have to achieve your goal? And identify not just what you have to have, but realistically, what do you think your station is someday going to be? We've all got limits on our time commitments. We've got limits on our money we can chuck at this. Some of us, like John there, he's setting up a station in North Carolina. He has the real estate to be able to set something up. Identify what you really expect your station to be. You're not going to just go out in most cases, unless you win the lottery and can convince a lot of people to come out and do all your work for you. You're not going to be able to turn around and get that station next month or next year, even, for the most case. So while you're doing this, consider maintenance as you're building your station. Put in, if my rotor fails, how am I going to get my mast lifted up so I can change the rotor out? Maybe I ought to have a splice in a coax here so I can disconnect it for easy replacement, whatever. Consider maintenance as you go through building your station. And the whole time, keep your goal in mind while you're building it. And by that, I'll just give one example. Say you think you need to have, realistically, as Randy said in his talk that Ed sent out today, he wanted to have 3 towers, 300-foot towers. If you're building your station and you know you're going to have 3 towers someday, before you just go out and throw that first tower up in the middle of your backyard, think about, where am I going to put these other 2 when I finally get around to building them? Consider what your end goal is while you're doing your station build the whole time. That could also mean, well, I could make do with a micro keyer or something like that, and that'll get me going. But if you know you're going to be single operator 2 radio down the road, plan on getting the equipment you need so you don't have to go about repurchasing something later on, unless, of course, you come up with a good deal. And one thing that I learned the hard way, and a lot of other people have too, knowledge is critical in evaluating your ideas. It's best to know what in the heck you're supposed to be doing before you start throwing money at it and go, oops, I should have known this before I went and spent all that extra money and made this big costly mistake, and doesn't create goodwill. So best to gain that knowledge as much as you can before you go on. In the improvement strategy, the first thing I recommend you focus on, and it's really the biggest bang for the buck, is operating skills and antennas. Remember that thing about his and yours? Operating skills are what makes a difference. And antennas, kind of like speakers in a stereo, everybody knows antennas are critical. This will create a little bit of controversy. My opinion is initially amplifiers are a crutch and all they do is mask weakness. You can be a mediocre operator, but if you've got a 1500 watts, it'll make up for a lot of your mediocrity. And I think strongly that that's the case. I had a guy here at, I borrow his call every now and then for the WPX. His call is WJ4X, which is a really rare prefix. So I usually borrow that for WPXs. And he used to always brag and say, you need an amplifier. He'd tell everybody that. You got to have an amplifier. Well, after I started sending him my logs so that he could respond to QSLs, and he started seeing everybody I was working with just 100 watts and a Yagi at 50 feet, he said, you don't need an amplifier. He finally figured that part out. So initially, amplifiers are a crutch, and it's not just me that says that. I can go back here and find out where this is. Where did it go? The best of the best gain their winning edge, practicing the basics over and over in numerous forgettable events, often using inadequate radios and second-rate antennas. Discovering how to overcome such obstacles are lessons never forgotten. And that was a National Contest Journal profile by N6RO, who was a very, very good contester. And they go on to say, once you learn the skills of how to bust a pile up with a mediocre antenna as a low power operator, and then you combine that with, say, a 100-foot tower and maybe some monobanders and 1500 watts, you're amazed at what can happen. Decide what you like about playing radio. Be sure to include those capabilities in your improvement plan. Before we started here, we kicked around the idea a little bit about operating assisted or not. I decided I liked operating assisted. So as I built my station, my radios I had did not have the capability of a band map, and I didn't really have a computer that would handle heavy loads, processing loads. But what I ended up doing was made sure to incorporate that. I put a add-in SDR receiver into my TS590s, both of them, and bought myself a new i7 processor computer, and it really made a big difference. So decide what you like and include those capabilities in your improvement plan. You got to learn secrets from others. You can figure a lot of this stuff out yourself, but you're handicapping yourself. Everybody's willing to share, not everybody, but most people are willing to share everything they know. After all, I'm doing a lot of it right here, right now. K5ZD and his thing that he did out there did the same thing. There are secrets out there. Learn about them from others, but you got to be careful of where you get your information from. I finally started thinking of people as truth talkers and false prophets. And some people really know what they're talking about and what they say makes sense. Other people just kind of throw stuff out there. And when you're first starting out, it's kind of hard to tell if the person that you're listening to and trying to get advice from is worthwhile. So how do you figure that out? Well, I went ahead and early on thought, why don't I look and see if this person who's telling me how to score real high ever enters in contest? And if they do they ever score high? If they don't, what's the sense of me listening to them tell me how that should be done if they can't even do it themselves? Are they referenced by respected contesters? And not everybody is, but sometimes people you identify as really good contesters and really know what they're talking about will say, so-and-so says this. Well, I start looking at so-and-so. find out what information they have to pass along as well. And I seek out and follow their posts and their writings. The reflectors that are out there, in a lot of cases, some of them go back to like the 1990s, and the wisdom is wisdom is wisdom, no matter when it was put out. So I started doing searchable archives on their old things and finding out what they said years and years ago. Went through those old reflector posts. I threw this in, K4BAI, John. Everybody knows John if you contest at all. I threw this in because he's part of the Southeast Contest Club who I did this for. And if John talks, I listen. I know a lot of other people do as well. Another good place to go is this list.contesting.com Piper Mail CQ contest. If you haven't been there, very much worthwhile to go and check that out. That's the one I was talking about. It goes back to the 1990s. And there are many other reflectors out there, but very, very useful. A lot of things I will do is I'll Google some of the contest clubs like the PVRC or the Mad River Contest Club or the Florida Club. You've seen some of those things in the Swamp Fox newsletter. I put them in there. Although the contest clubs have all kinds of useful information too. And if you go out on Groups.io, some of the contest reflectors or some of the Groups.io from the contest clubs out there are free open access, so you can see what they're talking about and get some ideas about things too. Contest University, have it every year from Dayton. They have a website. Just Google Contest University, and they have all kinds of great presentations going back for many, many years, and I've studied them thoroughly. Lots and lots of good, useful information in there about how to do things. And Truth Talkers, go to their websites and the people they mentioned. WAJI is one of my Truth Talkers. He's got a fantastic website, and you can take a look and see with him. K9LA, I forget how you say his last name, but he's the propagation guy, Carl Luschbager, or however it is. He's got outstanding things. Gary, W9XT, has stuff. Tennessee Contest Group has some things about contesting 101 talks, all kinds of different places to go. And John, if you want, I'll forward this presentation to you so you can look it all up, but do whatever you want. Took me a while to figure this one out. Good advice may not always be applicable to you. Keep yourself open to all ideas, but evaluate them. And the biggie there is New England ops running high power with 3 towers and they primarily run. They're going to operate differently than little old me in South Carolina with a low power search and pounce ops. And I use a Yagi, but I also have some wires too. So you can't just take everything that people say and say, oh, that's what I got to do, because it may not be applicable to where you're at in your contesting career or the station you may end up having. You will grow. So I have, I don't know, a couple gigabytes of contesting information on my hard drive. And periodically, every few months, I'll just go back and run through the things and look it over. Stuff that didn't make much sense to me, now that I've grown a little bit more and understand, means a lot more to me. So review, go back over old material for new ideas as you grow. And another thing is tricks don't work every time. You get something that works for you. Have a big bag of them that you can draw from. Learn a bunch of them, have them in the back of your head so you can haul them out when you get in a particular situation on the air trying to bust a pile up or figure out propagation. If you're not sure what types of things, I said knowledge is important. Here are just some Kickstarter ideas for you. Get on the air, find out what antennas successful ops use and why. I've done some presentations about antennas and all kinds of stuff. I won't get into that, but takeoff angles. That was what kicked me off. I heard all these people talking about takeoff angles, and I knew about them, but I didn't really understand why they thought it was so important. So that was what really jumped into. And one of the first things I learned about contesting was how critical takeoff angles are. A lot of people don't know it, but a $30 dipole is often within 3 dB of an $800 Yagi. So those of you who think you need a Yagi, that's not necessarily true. 1 dB does matter for many reasons. I won't go into why. Feed line loss. I didn't know, for example, that there's extra loss simply due to a high SWR in the feed line. I thought it was just the length and whatever the loss at that frequency was it. Nope, there's more to it. Got to know propagation opportunities when they pop up so you can control your operating time correctly. If you don't know it, the attenuator RF gain knob is your friend. I'll let you figure out why. And common mode current and things along those lines. Let me pause this just a second if I can. I don't know how to turn my mic there. Any questions before I go on here? Okay. Let's see. Where else are we? Oh. And the biggest concept of all, the most important part of a station is you, the operator. You don't know that? Truly, truly is. Your attitude is what's going to determine really how good you are. You got to be driven to improve. You'll only reach the top 5 if you work at it. And I mean that in a competitive category. Don't kid yourself that a win in the 80-meter QRP category of a state QSO party implies you're a competitive contester. You may be, but the odds are pretty good you're not. Sometimes winning is losing. Time to listen. Take time to listen to good people operating big pileups. I can't emphasize that enough. You don't think you're doing well enough, and I mentioned earlier about comparing yourself to other people, study why they do so well. It really makes a big difference if you can understand why they do the things that they do. And what I do after every contest, or all but one or two, literally write down on a piece of paper or type it out on a computer list or in your 3830 blurbs or posting this to your SCCC or the Swamp Fox group reflectors. Write down what you learned and the problems encountered after each contest. If you can't articulate what you did wrong, you didn't learn the lesson. And if you articulate what you did wrong, you know how that you got a good start on combating it and fixing the problem down the road. Gather and study everything contest related you can find. Like I said, I've got a couple gigs on my hard drive for just that very reason. I went out and found all these different websites that told me all about everything I could. Some people disagree with this, but in my opinion, good enough is actually good enough. Everybody's got their performance thresholds there. I will argue to you that people like W3LPL and K3LR and other big stations like that have made compromises in their antenna selections, even though they've got all these big antennas and towers. They decided what they needed to have and decided that maybe spending $200,000 to make it a big improvement, that just wasn't quite worthwhile. Most of us down at our level, we can't quite afford anything near what they have. So you need to, back there with your contest goals and your station, what do you think you're realistically going to end up with? Decide what's good enough. And if you don't want to be a competitive contester and be in the top 5, ain't nothing wrong with that. Figure out what you want to do and what's going to make you happy being a contester. And that's what your focus ought to be. Each person has their own threshold of what's good enough. And that depends on why you contest, your skill level, and your available resources in your station. The threshold will change as you become better. And consider that as well. If you really, really believe you're going to become a great contester, keep that thought in mind. My minimal acceptable threshold is going to be this in 3 or 4 years. Keep that in mind while you're building your station. This one, I hope you all downloaded that file I sent out about the thing. Page 2 of that is a thing which talks about focus and mental bandwidth, and there's a really good example about it. And I fell right into this same situation when I started contesting. All I could focus on was how to make a contact. How to, do I spin the radio now? What do I do? How do I make this happen? And my mentor, Jim VE7ZO, he was on a run station and I was on a mult station at a multi. And while I'm trying to work somebody, he would be running people at 100, 150 an hour rate. He would be looking at me, telling me, "Oh, you got that call wrong." He'd have his phone open and he'd be checking propagation things on his phone, and he'd be sending messages through the interstation chat network to these passing stations here and there. That's what we mean by mental bandwidth. Focus. You got, if you're button chair and you want to be competitive, you better be figuring out how to make contacts all the time. And we'll get into that a little bit more. The second thing that I figured out on my own pretty much is I found myself wasting too much time trying to figure out how to get to a control in my radio. I figured out that as I'm trying to bust a pile up and I'm saying, well, should I be a tail ender or should I try to throw my call in first? Should I use this phonetic? Should I use that phonetic? What works? That I was losing the opportunity to bust pileups. So everything has to be second nature to you. Don't think about it. Recognize, make it so that you instantly recognize the situation and how best to break this up. And this will come up in a minute or two, but an example to that is in one of the other presentations, I give a talk about how the experience of the running station determines how I try to bust a pile up and get in there. If a person is really inexperienced and 8 people call them at the same time, they just freeze like a deer in the headlights. And if that's the case, they can't respond. They can't process what's going on and grab a call out. So in that case, being a tail ender, waiting until the initial pause is over, works best. But if you have somebody who's an experienced contester and you try to wait, they're going to grab a call out of that first group, and you're never going to break that pile up either. As a low power, little pistol search and pounce operator, for the most part, I can evaluate in just how the person's tone is, the excitement level they use, if I heard their call before, how calm they sound, yada, yada, yada. Within almost every case, within less than a second, I know what tool I'm going to use without even have to think about it because I judge the experience of the operator. And that's the type of thing that you need to get to, is how you can go about determining what tool to use when. It all has to be second nature for you. Continuous improvement, you got to drive continuous improvement all the time. I can't focus on that enough if you want to improve. This is weird. Bruce Lee. He says, if you always put limits on everything you do, physical or anything else, it'll spread into your work and into your life. There are only plateaus, and you must not stay there. You must go beyond them. Fight learning plateaus. If you're a CW operator or whatnot, if you learned old school, you learned there was a plateau at 5 words a minute, 13 words a minute, 20 words a minute. If you learn the new way about it, I think that skips some of that, which is a good thing. But about the time I started learning about plateaus was from listening to a guy talk about memory tricks and how he would flip open 3 or 4 decks of cards and he could remember every card in order. And then they started timing it down, and he ended up having memory plateaus and only hitting a certain limit, and he couldn't go beyond it until he pushed past the limit. And he talked about his dad, who was a golfer, had a certain handicap when the kid was growing up, the guy doing the card flipping. When he was growing up, his dad had a certain handicap. And now that he's 30 years old, his dad has the same handicap, and he thinks he's doing fine. Well, he probably is, because he's happy at that, but that's a plateau. You got to push through this and get beyond it. One way I learned to fight that was when I wrote down the things after a contest, lessons learned. First I had like dozens of them, but I would pick 2 or 3 that I thought were critical, and I would write them on a yellow sticky note, and I'd paste them up there next to my monitor or right there on the radio. And if I'd find my attention starting to wander, I'd notice that yellow sticky note, and I'd read what it says, and I'd say, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be working on this, and it'd read directly back into it. And after a couple, 3 contests, if I felt I had mastered that particular concept enough, I'd pull that yellow sticky note down and grab another one from the list and put another one up there. And that really brought it home to me each and every contest throughout the contest of what my weaknesses were and how I could go about combating it and make it happen. Now, I talked about amplifiers being a crutch, and same thing with a strong station, but a lot of operators with strong station and amplifiers are really good. But there are a couple different styles, depending upon what your station is. If you got a strong station, you just blast through everybody and make it happen. But if you're a little pistol like me and a bunch of others here, you need that craftiness and the finesse. So you need to learn those skills, how to make that happen. And top competitors use both based on the situation because there are a lot of big dogs out there, and sometimes even the guys with strong stations have to use that craftiness and finesse. We just talked a little bit about pileups not created equal and level. We went over that a minute ago. A lot of people, old timers especially, think that assisted operation is just a point. You got a spot comes up, you click on it, and instantly your radio goes there and you work them and you're done. That doesn't really work if you're trying to be a competitive contester. Uh, yeah, you can do that, but in my experience, running is critical to overall rate. So even though you're an S&P op primarily and you're assisted doing point and click, if you're not running, if you don't have the skills to run, you're not going to be competitive. You may get a good score, but you're not going to be competitive in the top 5 on a regular basis. In a competitive category. Uh, Switch between run and spot jumping, knob spinning to maintain rate. Your run goes down. I've shown this in a couple other things. Go ahead and switch to spot jumping or spinning the knob. And of course, the best pileup tool is no pileup. Use the VFO even when you're assisted. I've said this before, but there's virtually not a single contest I've ever operated in is assisted, which I do probably 80, 90% of the time now. Not a single contest I've been in where I haven't spun the knob and found a station on my own. Uh, this one, a lot of people don't like it. It doesn't seems counterintuitive, but if you want to be competitive, you got to waste time for a while. You got to try different things, learn what works, learn what doesn't work for you, and it doesn't always work all the time. So you got to learn when it works and when you got a high percentage of it working and when it doesn't. So just take time, waste time. Say, I'm going to try different things in this contest and get the best score you can, but focus on improvement for a while. I did that for a couple, 3 years before I really started trying to begin to move up in the standings. Really made an improvement for me. Touch typing, I know a lot of people do hunt and peck, but if you can touch type, it's really beneficial. And if you're not using Intersend message, N1MM has that, and so do several others. And if you don't know what it is, that's part of your homework. Look it up. If you're not using Intersend's message, you're definitely putting yourself in a little bit of hurts because you're not using some of the automation that'll let you sit button share more more often, and it'll cut down on the amount of mistakes you make. It does take some time to learn how to use ESM without making mistakes, though. That was part of the things I practiced for a while. Again, thoroughly know how to use important station controls. It has to be second nature for you. I use cheat sheets for logger shortcuts. Had them up color-coded to make them easy to find for a long time. Call recognition, several of y'all talk about that on the reflector as time comes up. And if you do the CWTs especially, you begin to see call recognition. I'm going to pick on KY4ID a little bit. What he mentioned in one of his lessons learned was he thought he was doing well with call recognition because he could pick out the ones from CWTs all the time. But once he moved out of that little small area of operation of a CWT into a DX contest, everything went out the window. He didn't have the same type of call recognition or anything that he did. Super check partial is a real good thing to use. Some people call it cheating, but here's my philosophy on that. If it's allowed by the rules and your competition is using it and it's an aid and it's helping them outscore you, then you're a fool for not using something like that. And I've learned that it really helps me out with running. Pulling some of the weaker stations out gives me a good guess for what they are. I still make sure I hear what they say because accuracy is critical, and you don't want to have point deductions for putting the wrong call in there. I still make sure I hear what they say. But the super check partial, if you're not using it, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. A lot of people thought for a long time that if you use a band map, then that automatically kind of makes you assisted. You got to have spots populating the band map. That's not true. You can set it up in 1mm. So if you try to work somebody as search and pounce and you can't, don't get them after a couple tries and you tune off, it'll automatically throw that station up on the band map for you. And then you come through the band the next time, you know that, hey, that guy's probably still there and I need to work him. Or you also have it set up so after you work somebody, N1M throws them up on the band map and it's a gray call. Next time going through the band, you see, oh, that guy there, probably I've worked him last time. So you can just skip right over that. You run the risk of somebody new, but the odds are, if you do that, passes through the man map a couple times real quick, that they haven't moved and it's the same station you did before. And that is not assisted operation. That's no different than taking somebody's call and writing it down on a piece of paper next to your operating station saying WN4EFP is on 7038. And that way I know next time I come through and I look, I can check that paper or I can look at the band map. Much easier to look at the band map. Winning often comes down to these three things: button share time. And to make button share time, you got to have determination. I'm going to sit here. I'm going to make those contacts. I'm going to put in 30 hours, whatever the case may be. Physical stamina. You all hear me whining a lot. I got problems with my leg, nerve damage in my leg. Sometimes it's hard to sit here for that particular amount of time. And ergonomics. You got to have it set up so that you don't get carpal tunnel or get an ache in your shoulder or whatever the case may be. Ergonomics are critical to button share time. And winning often comes down to that. He or she who sits in the operating chair the most has the greatest chances of winning. This one was a epiphany for me, and I've talked about this in a couple other presentations too. And what this represents is a theoretical contest. After 3 hours, I've got 100 QSOs in the log, not a very good rate. But when I get one more QSO, it gives me 120 points. Now, if that Q happened to be a mult, instead of 120, I get 423 points. That's better, but 120 doesn't really do a lot for me. You know, if people get hundreds of thousands of points, 120 doesn't mean much. And if it happens to be a double mult, like in some of the CQ worldwides, 726, that's respectable. I will chase a double mult, but I'm not really all that concerned when I first started out in this wonderful thing of contesting about that measly little 120 points. Well, let's take a look at what happened at the end of this same contest. Now, getting that one Q gave me a minimum of 1,467 points. Yeah, I'm going to try to get that Q. If it's a mult, 4,400. If it's a double, 7,400. I'm excited about those scores at the end of this thing. But the thing most people don't realize is if I took that Q away way back there at 100, I'm going to have one less left at the very end. So instead of 1082, I'd only have 1081, and I'd have lost that 1,400 points. So that little old measly Q way back there at 100 to 101 isn't worth 120. It's worth whatever the final Q is at the end of the contest. When you're talking about motivation and drive and focus, as soon as you sit down on the operator chair and that starting gun goes off, you are actually getting 1,400 points every single Q you put in the log from second one. And that's pretty motivational. So that changed how I approach things quite a bit. And along with that, a lot of people say they don't really much care. They'll take a guess at what a call is. If you lose a point because you got the wrong call in the log or whatever the case may be, you lose that 1,400 points. And in most contests, you lose 2 or 3 times that many points, whatever it might be. So you got to find a balance between aggressiveness and penalties. If you're too trying for that golden log, you're not being aggressive enough at contesting, and you're hurting yourself just as much. So you got to learn to find a balance between them. Antennas. Can't say enough about them. And if you don't know about takeoff angles and lobes and where they go, like Scott, we talked a little about you and your G5 RV today. that lobe headed towards Europe, that's exactly where you want it for 20 meters. But if you go on to 15 meters, take a look at that G5RV and you'll find out lobes go in different directions. So that's some of the things to be thinking about. Proper use of antennas and all that will help you reduce QRM and QRN. Receive antennas is what most people think of, but you also need to be thinking about high angle radiation coming into you from, say, Ohio or something on a low antenna, where if you get a good design antenna, it will reject a lot of the high angle radiation. And you ought to have more than one per band because of all those different lobes, not to mention if a piece of equipment fails in that one antenna, you'd be able to have another antenna and keep working. A lot of people don't think so, but wires are very effective and verticals work. Think antenna system regarding power loss. Don't just say, oh, I've got a 3 dB antenna, I'm doing good because I'm using low loss LMR 400 going to it. You also got to think about tuner loss. You got to think about balun loss. You got to think about how many connectors have I got in there, yada, yada, yada. Think the entire system. If you don't know what I'm talking about, again, that's part of your homework assignment. Common mode current. Didn't know what that was or how important that was for a long time. Those are just a couple of the things that it'll do for you. It's well worth your time looking at that, and it's well worth your time understanding how common mode current can cause your baluns to burn up if you're real chintzy on the baluns you get. Contesting stations can develop a lot of heat in a balun that has a high SWR on the other side of it. Automation. You don't hear a lot about this necessarily in talks about improving yourself as a contester, but they simplify your band change. You know, I'm talking about sitting in the chair for 35, 36, 39 hours. You get a little bit tired and a little bit punchy. And a lot of times you may end up not having the correct band changes when you switch your radio. I want to be able to just push a button on my radio and have it automatically select the proper antenna to get me on that band. I don't want to have to remember, oh yeah, I got to run over here and move this jumper to that particular connector whenever I go to this band. And the same thing with manual tune amplifiers. You know, hopefully you don't switch around a lot, but if you've got a automatic tuning amplifier, same thing comes into play. Fewer mistakes when you're tired, visually easier for station awareness. We had a presentation a while ago about operating remotely, and they had up there on the screen the coverage of the Yagi when it was pointing in what direction. Much easier to see that type of stuff. I mentioned about Anderson's message, ESM, makes it much easier to do SO2R and SO2V. You get that set up correctly because you don't have to try and send on each side. You just push a button and let the software do it for you. And it'll reduce operator fatigue. And there's these things, Touch Portal and Stream Deck. These are similar type of things. This is my Touch Portal screen. And this is nothing more than a 8-inch Android tablet. And I downloaded this software on it. And rather than reaching over to the radio and selecting which antenna I want, I just reach over. You can see this is my keyboard. Move my hand over, tap that little touch screen there, and I'll switch antennas or tap the preamp on or off. This will, if I tap that, it'll send my call. I could do it by up here, but if I'm outside of this, say I'm over in another screen off here and another one, and then I have to go back to N1 and M, highlight in the entry window, then hit an F key. I don't have to do that. I can just tap that, and it'll automatically shift focus back to N1 and M, send my call if I happen to be outside of that. Quick edit, force log. You can mark things busy. So if you come across Joe Bob talking about his tractor on 40 meters, and you know he's not in the contest, you just tap that and it'll put up in your band map, hey, that's not a contester, so don't waste your time next time coming through. These types of things really can help out and reduce it. Same with switching through filters real quick. So rather than having to look up at my radio when I turn a little knob to figure out what my filter bandwidth is, I can just tap that and instantly go to the proper CW or sideband filter that I have set up. So those types of things are why I say automation is critical for being a competitive operator. Let me get back in here. And of course, toys are fun, but Murphy likes complexity. So the more of this stuff you get in there, the more chance you got of things going wrong. So you got to balance it out a little bit. I never used to think a band scope on a radio was important, but now that I've used one, you can find stations on dead bands real easy. I can see where people are calling CQ. I can find myself an open band to use. It's become almost an indispensable tool. If you don't have dual receive and you want to be a competitive contester, you either need dual receive or SO2R, assuming you're going to actually reach that competitive level. You're going to end up finding yourself your bandwidth and your mental bandwidth and your focus will improve so much that you're wasting time looking around, and you're going to need some way to improve your score, and that means bringing in those extra cues. If you don't know why so many people look at oh, my mind just went blank. Whatever his name is, Sherwood's transmitter things are important. With RMDR, you ought to study that a little bit. SDR radios are different, but they have different problems as well. Spend some time studying on that and learn what the advantages and disadvantages are and how to use yours and how to make it work. Check 3830 and QRZ for what the winners are using. That's radios, antennas, the whole 9 yards. What are they using? Check out their stations and give you some ideas of what to happen. And you have to identify and mitigate your local noise sources as much as possible. Things like battery chargers or neighbors that are out there. Or I've got something I think that's in my my heat pump starting to make a little bit of noise. I got to get in there and try to identify noise sources. Get rid of those things so you can hear the weak ones out there. Make it happen. A lot of people will debate this claim that I'm making, but you can do a lot with a little. Your skill at busting pileups can often trump their 3 elements at 100 feet, 12 dB amp gain. Why in the world would I make a claim like that? Because I did what I said I would advise you to do on the previous page. I went to the 3830 scores, found out who was beating me. I went out to the QRZ.com web pages and looked to see what the people who were using that were beating me. And gee, I'm a low power operator with a Yagi at 50 feet and 100 watts in South Carolina, and I was beating a heck of a lot of those people up there in New England that had 100-foot towers and were running 1,500 watts. Your skill at busting pileups can trump their 3 elements at 100 feet, 12 dB amp gain. I stand by that. Knowing your rig controls helps you hear the weak ones, reduces fatigue for more button share time. You learn how to get rid of some of the atmospheric noise and things is just the one example I was thinking of when I did that. The biggest obstacle of success is thinking you cannot compete. You can. That isn't an urine thing. Little pistols can hold a frequency, but some fighting is required. You got to know when you can run. I once made a mistake and I clicked on a spot I didn't know I did and ended up on the same frequency as K3LR and tried to run them off. That didn't work very well. Got to know when you can run. When to give up the frequency fight. It doesn't pay, especially as a little pistol, to get into a frequency fight in most cases. But I've had people move in on me frequency. One of the recent ones was when the colleges were having their college competition, and I'm calling CQ, and this guy comes in 20 over S9, and I know darn well he could hear me, and he just started calling CQ, and he just kept calling CQ, CQ, CQ. Well, I just kept going right through him too, because I knew darn well he could hear me. And I mentioned in a post about that trick of having score or calls to throw out there and fake things. I threw that on him, and after a little bit of time, he just moved off. You're going to have to fight a little bit now and then. And you got to know when to leave a pileup. That rule of twos things comes into play. You just got to move on sometimes if you're a little pistol. Have a workaround method for equipment failures. Try to have a spare this, spare that. Know what you'll do if an antenna breaks. Have an extra piece of coax laying around, jumper, whatever the case may be. Here's some things about propagation you ought to understand. If you're doing CW or FT8, I guess has it. RTTY does now too. Look at the RBN, reverse beacon network, if you're not, and look at the spots of your stations. Figure out if you're strong enough in those where you're strong enough at, and is it worth trying to run or not trying to run. That is an excellent tool, the RBN. Expectant openings, you need to learn what they are, look at your forecast, use prediction programs, several of them out there. Gray line is gray line, but in a lot of cases they have skewed gray line paths that don't come into play. That there's a thing out there about rediscovering gray line or rethinking gray line propagation, and a big explanation about how most gray line is not actually gray line. It's a skewed path mechanism that dumps out into broad daylight on the other end. And a lot of people don't understand about backscatter. And in case you're not really up to speed on it, I use this a lot. I work K4BAI, John, over in Georgia a lot on 10 and 15, mostly 10, but 15 meters sometimes. We both point south and are working South American stations, and I'll hear John real faint. But what's happening is my signal goes down and bounces off the mountains in South America, and then comes back up to John there in Georgia. And if he's running stations, I'm too weak so that he can hear me. But if he's calling CQ and nobody answers, he'll go ahead and pull me out. I'll do the same thing trying to work Maryland sometimes on those bands. I point out towards the Rockies. Maryland's pointed out towards the Rockies, and I can pick them up on backscatter that way. Again, if they're running people, they're not going to hear you, but learn how to use that. It's a good ally. Operate environment. Again, we said it directly impacts button chair time and the fun factor. This is something a lot of people don't think of, but the controls that are critical to your operation, your log window, in my case, the band map and the molten Q window, my spectrum display, all those are on the main screen right dead in front of me. I like to know how my rate is, but that's not something that's critical. So I put that on one of the other monitors. I like to know what the real-time scoreboard is, but that's not critical. So that doesn't go on my main monitor. It goes off to the side a little bit. You want your critical controls and info front and center. And if you don't, it really does help to have multiple monitors to move this other useful information off somewhere where you can get to it. If you've got to go ahead and hide it behind a window because you only got one monitor, then of course it says you're going to be in that other window and not have N1MM active whenever the call comes in, and then you're going to be messed up and not be able to get that logged quick right away. Physical. I'm got to have a comfortable chair. And even though you got a comfortable chair, I've learned to love that purple seat cushion the truckers use. I've mentioned that a time or two. Very useful to have a seat cushion for us old folk. And a lot of people starting out think that Heil makes the only headset. Definitely not true. And if you do have one, you can get ear cushion replacements. I had some for a while. I think Frank's still using his too. Another thing to do is if you get sore ears, have a couple different style of headsets and swap them out every couple of hours. I like this Radio Sport headset now. It's kind of a different thing. I don't know if you can see it here or not. Got those big old hard things like the Heils do, but I've used the Heils, and this is pretty much similar to it. I just really like that headset a lot. You want to automate actions that are repetitive, so it reduces your muscle strain. That way you can keep going longer, and complex so that you make fewer mistakes. Identify and mitigate distractions. If you got time to surf the internet, you've got the bandwidth you need, mental bandwidth, to go SO2V or SO2R. You shouldn't be surfing the internet. You're wasting time you're not making cues. You're constantly watching the online scoreboard. I like it. I know Ed likes it and puts out there a whole lot. It's a great thing, great tool, keep your button chair, etc. But if you find yourself fixating on it, looking up there all the time, how's he doing now? How's he doing now? You're not spending enough time focused on getting them cues in the log. Turn to VFO. If you're running and still watching it, it's time to do SO2R and SO2V. Move distractions out of front and center. In this one, what I try to do is evaluate while I'm operating. If I start finding myself getting a crook neck because I'm looking up at this, that, or the other, either it's important and it's in the wrong place and I need to move it down to front and center, or I'm letting myself get distracted too much. So move things out of front and center. I'm not an expert at a lot of this stuff. These are things that have worked for me throughout the whole talk, but pre-contest critique is kind of critical too. I like to look at my equipment. What were the station's weaknesses? And you can't just talk about one contest there. You got to look at several similar contests and look at what was a problem over multiple contests. What were the issues? What did I have a problem with? And ask yourself, were the things I used front and center? You want to evaluate if you had bad band change decisions. You can do that by looking at other people's logs. People that beat you, go look and see if you can figure out what they did. Some logs are made public. You can download them if you want. SH5 and other things are out there. It'll let you look at people's logs. Did you have the proper sleep or off time strategies? Operating skill failures. What did you do right? What did you do wrong? Equipment failures. Modifications to your F key messages. Maybe something didn't work right and you had to waste time changing it in the middle of the contest. I've done that more than once. And most of y'all probably don't know Jer, KT4ZB. And if you didn't know who he was, you won't now because he's a silent key. But he's the first guy I set my sights on. I'm going to beat Jer. And it took me a couple of years, but I finally started neck and neck with Jer. And about that time, he noticed me and we started talking back and forth. And we had a good drive to push each other to do well. And I always do that after contest. How did Jer do? Or whoever I happen to have my sights on. Again, critical to write down the lessons learned and make your sticky notes for next time. Be sure to log what went right so that you can remember that next time, not just try things different out. And log check report or unique busted not in log reports, you should know what they are and spend some time looking at them. That's one of the biggest things you can do to improve accuracy is start finding out what you got wrong. So in summary, attitude determines your competitiveness. No doubt about it. Operating skills can overcome equipment deficiencies. You need to have honest and critical self-evaluation. It's necessary. Don't kid yourself. You're only hurting yourself if you're not honest with yourself. And there's far more to competitive contesting than simply saying 5905. Close out with two other things. We've said these before, and they're in the file I sent out. With experience comes knowledge and cunning. I can't stand here and tell you the secrets, as many of them are second nature to me now. That's what drove me into that second nature thing. And the best of the best gain their winning edges practicing the basics over and over in numerous forgettable events, often using inadequate radios and second-rate antennas, discovering how to overcome obstacles, lessons never forgotten. For those of you who might not believe it, turn your amplifiers off. Do a low-power contest sometime, see what happens. Thank you, and good hunting.